U.S. President Donald Trump threatened Canada with, quote, severe fertilizer tariffs.
Tensions between Canada and the United States. U.S. President Donald Trump has abruptly reversed course on a new trade relationship between Canada and China. Trump had previously supported the recently signed deal, but now he's making fresh tariff threats.
A new U.S. tariff threat, this time focusing on Canadian fertilizer.
A lot of it does come in from Canada. And so we'll end up putting very severe tariffs on that if we have to, because that's the way you want to bolster here, and we can do it here.
There's a number at the center of this story that the Trump administration does not want American farmers to think about too carefully. 85%. That is the share of all potash imported into the United States that comes from Canada. And the United States imports 93% of the potash it consumes, which means Canada does not merely supply a commodity to its southern neighbor. Canada controls the single input that American agriculture cannot function without. And Prime Minister Mark Carney holds that card at exactly the moment Donald Trump's tariff regime is most vulnerable to pressure. This is not a talking point. It is a supply chain reality built over decades, and the mathematics behind it are unforgiving. In 2023, the United States produced approximately 400,000 metric tons of potash domestically. That same year, American farmers consumed approximately 5.3 million metric tons. That is a gap of more than 13 times domestic production. Canada's potash mining sector, operating primarily out of Saskatchewan, was 36 times larger than the entire American industry by production volume in 2024. Canada holds 1.1 billion tons of potash reserves, 5 times the size of American reserves, and contributes roughly 32% of total global potash production. When Josh Linville, vice president of fertilizer at StoneX, was asked directly about the risk of disrupting this supply relationship, his answer required no elaboration. The problem is, if we start to upset Canada, where else around the world do you start to go? The other suppliers in the list do not solve the problem. He is correct. Russia supplies 11% of U.S. potash, but sanctions and geopolitical instability make that source structurally unreliable. Belarus provides 4% and faces identical complications. Israel supplies 3%, but lacks the production capacity to scale anywhere near the volume Canada currently delivers. None of these alternatives, individually or combined, come close to replacing what Canada provides. 5 American states have potash deposits: New Mexico, Utah, North Dakota, Arizona, and Michigan. But domestic facilities cannot rapidly scale production. The Carlsbad, New Mexico operation has been managing lower quality ore for years. Developing a new potash mine from exploration to full production is measured in years, not months. If Canadian supply were disrupted tomorrow, American domestic capacity could not compensate in time for the 2026 growing season, or likely the one following it. In November 2025, the United States formally added potash to its critical minerals list, an official designation confirming its strategic importance to the country. And yet Canada, America's primary source of that critical mineral, remains the target of the same tariff regime that created this standoff. Fertilizer accounts for 30 to 45% of a U.S. farmer's annual operating costs, depending on the crop. For corn specifically, USDA Economic Research Service data shows fertilizer has represented between 33 and 44% of production costs since 2020. And unlike manufacturers, farmers cannot pass these costs downstream. Corn, wheat, and soybeans sell into commodity markets at prices farmers do not set. When input costs rise, farmers absorb them directly. There is no customer to charge more. This dynamic has played out before, and the data from that episode is instructive. Relative to the 2010 to 2019 average, fertilizer costs per acre in 2022 were 110 higher for corn and 141 higher for wheat, driven by the Russia-Ukraine conflict's disruption to global fertilizer markets. The U.S. prices paid index tracking farmer input costs reached 149.9 in June 2025, up from 139.9 the prior year, with fertilizer as the primary driver, rising 11 within that index alone. The agronomic timing compounds the risk considerably. The large 2025 harvest depleted phosphate and potash levels from American soil. Those nutrients must be replenished before the next planting cycle or yields decline. Fall applications for the 2026 growing season are approximately 7 months away. That window is the pressure point, and Canada's supply posture will determine whether American farmers can enter the 2026 season with properly restored soil or whether they're rationing a depleted input and absorbing the yield consequences that follow. If application rates fall because potash becomes unavailable or prohibitively expensive, the damage does not appear immediately. It surfaces in the 2026 harvest, when millions of acres of undernourished soil produce less corn, less wheat, and less soybeans simultaneously. The Trump administration's response to agricultural sector losses has included a $12 billion aid package for farmers affected by trade policy disruptions. Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins herself acknowledged that fertilizer input costs were, in her words, skyrocketing. But $12 billion does not resolve a structural supply shortage. It is compensation for losses already occurring. It does not fix the underlying dependency. Net U.S. farm income is already forecast to fall by $30 billion. A potash-specific disruption accelerates that number significantly. Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, a Republican representing one of the largest agricultural states in the country, has already advocated for potash exemptions from tariffs, specifically citing its indispensability. That is not opposition politics. That is a senator from farm country recognizing, ahead of the worst-case scenario, that potash cannot be treated as an ordinary tariff-affected good. Corey Rosenbusch, president and CEO of the Fertilizer Institute, stated plainly that an open, fair, and predictable trade environment between the U.S. and Canada is vital to supporting a fertilizer industry that meets the needs of American growers, and that restrictions on cross-border fertilizer trade drive up costs for farmers that are ultimately felt by consumers at the grocery store. The nitrogen and sulfur picture adds further weight. Canada supplies nearly 10 of U.S. nitrogen fertilizer needs, representing 25 of total U.S. nitrogen imports, and nearly 20 of the sulfur American farmers consume. A disruption to Canadian fertilizer trade is not a single nutrient problem. It touches all three primary inputs, nitrogen, phosphate, and potash, that together determine whether American soil can sustain commercial-scale crop production. Carol McKeon, professor of land and food systems at the University of British Columbia, described the Canadian export restriction scenario as, quote, kind of like going to the nuclear option. She noted that consumers may not feel the price impact immediately because cost increases take time to move through the food supply chain before reaching grocery store shelves. But the trajectory, once set in motion, is difficult to reverse. The strategy of using tariffs to pressure Canada was designed to protect American economic interests. What it has produced instead is a structural exposure, a dependency on Canadian supply that no tariff revenue can offset and no domestic alternative can replace on any timeline that matters to the 2026 growing season. Mark Carney does not need to announce an export ban. He does not need to escalate publicly. The leverage exists in the dependency itself, and every week this standoff continues, that leverage compounds. Canada holds a card that the American agricultural system cannot afford to have played. And right now, it is Carney's hand to play.